Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Imogen Ragone, who's an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And for this podcast, Imogen's actually going to interview me, and the topic is going to be a brief history of Alexander Technique directions. So, Imogen, welcome.
Thank you. And this sounds very interesting. So why don't we just start with what are Alexander Technique directions?
Well, I would define them as self-instructions that are designed to improve the quality of our posture and how we move as we go through life.
Well, that's
And keep it
nice.
very short.
hmm
And they, as far as we know, the first directions came from F. Matthias Alexander.
Right.
And I don't think we know exactly when he came up with them.
You mean
Um,
that we don't know a date
a
or
date.
a year even? Yeah.
We don't know a date, but we do know that certainly by the early 1930s, he was using a three-part um, series of directions that would run along the lines of head forward, um, back to lengthen and widen. Oh, sorry. Let me
Neck,
start over
neck to
again.
be
Neck,
free.
neck. Whoops, wrong sequence. Neck free, head to go forward and up, and back to lengthen and widen. Some variation on that. It was actually often three separate sentences. And that's what he was using, and variations of that are all still in use. And I do believe some teachers pretty much use those exact directions today.
Right. And I think sometimes there was a fourth one which's about knees forward and away, right?
Well, you could tag on additional ones.
hmm
Yeah, knees forward and away, elbows releasing away. You could add on extra ones.
hmm
The To me, a basic problem with those directions is, first of all, it's an awful lot of information for someone to uh, bring to bear on his or herself, especially in light of what we know from neuroscience today, which is that most of us have somewhere between maybe five or and eight or nine memory slots available in our
Mm.
brain for new things. That is, we can only, or things that we can pay attention to. We can only attend to a finite number of things.
And so when you say nine, that sounds like a lot, but I'm thinking a lot of those slots are taken up by
Just getting
um
on with life, things that you need to look after.
mhm.
And also, some neuroscientists think the number is a bit smaller. I've heard the number five plus or minus two as a more realistic number. But whatever the number is, it's relatively small, and to put in three new ideas at one time is, for most people, very, very challenging. Now, Alexander was asked about that, and he said, well, one after another, all at the same time.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, what that means, I really don't know. But it's clear from early writings that a lot of students, including people on his training course, had a lot of trouble with those directions. That
Mm.
it was major frustration for teachers. So but that's what Alexander used in the early 30s. I think over time, what happened is that, and I don't really know this part of the history all that well, and I would certainly be interested in hearing from people who do, but the word let or the word allow started creeping in.
Yeah, that's certainly the way they, were first introduced to me, those kind of classic
Right. So
directions.
instead of neck free, let the neck be free,
Hmm.
or allow the neck to be free, and allow your head to go forward and up, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But you still had this problem of an awful lot of thoughts, and you had another problem that I don't think was recognized for a long time. When people would talk about let your neck be free, teachers would sometimes emphasize the word let, so that the idea being that you weren't going to do anything, you were going to allow something to
Hmm.
happen.
Hmm.
And for sure, saying I'm letting my neck be free is a lot better than neck to be free or whatever, neck free. But the problem is, to me, is that it assumes that you know how to let your neck be free. And I think that is a faulty assumption. I think if most people don't know how to let their neck be free, and to give them a self command that requires them to do something they may not be able to do is not leading to the most effective self directing. So I think that's
Right,
kind of
yeah.
those two
I think they were,
basic.
would you say I'm correct in that they were very much an accompaniment to the teacher's hands giving you an
Yes,
experience,
and I yes, and
rather than being purely on your own
I don't
there?
think I don't know whether they were designed to be used on your own outside of lessons or not. But yeah, typically the teacher would have their hands on you, and he or she might be uttering those phrases, and you were to kind of go along with them.
Hmm.
Again, that's a long time ago, and I wasn't there, but um, that's my sense. Now, when I first encountered the Alexander technique in the mid 70s, I had a teacher who never used directions for various reasons. I remember asking him about them once, and he said, "Oh, that's for when you're very advanced." So yeah, but when I got to England, there 78 basically started training. I noticed that the directions were used, but I never heard anyone use that sequence, at least not in the Carrington tradition. Maybe in the McDonald tradition they did, I'm not sure. But it seemed like the word let or allow had come into play a fair amount.
Hmm.
But one thing that I remember very clearly was asking different teachers what exactly they meant, and
Mm.
getting very different answers. And at one point, I had 5 different versions of what forward and up meant. I can't remember what they are now, but they were.
Oh, you
It's,
should have written
I
that
should have
down,
written them
Robert.
down, I know. But I remember thinking the whole thing was a bit fuzzy.
Mm.
It didn't seem like I certainly didn't go around thinking those directions outside of class. I don't believe.
So,
Yeah, I don't think I did. I don't know that we were encouraged to.
well, that's
Yeah.
strange because the books seem to suggest thinking for yourself.
Well, indeed, but I am just reporting on my own experience. Now, the next set of directions I came upon for me was in the late, well, early '80s, when I encountered Marjorie Barstow.
Uh-huh.
Now, Marge did not use those directions at all. She didn't say there was anything wrong with them, but she just said she preferred to use ones of her devising, and they tended to be along the line of move your head delicately away from your torso, and perhaps she might add in such a way that your torso can easily follow, that sort of thing. So she had made a fairly big break in a way with what was going on in England, in that
Hmm.
she actually would ask you to do something. although she would qualify it by do it very delicately.
Uh-huh.
And she would emphasize, you would get that quality from her hands as well. And I think that she, I think both she and the more traditional approach was approaching this intersection between thought and action, that there, first of all, there really is no such thing as a thought without some muscle activity.
Mm-hmm.
And the original directions kind of came at it from just think the thought and that will take care of it. That was certainly, Alexander even says that somewhere. Just, you don't need to do anything, just
Right.
put the thought out there. But of course you are doing something when you think a thought. It's just extremely subtle. And whereas Marge came at it from the movement end, but a very delicate movement.
Interesting.
So I personally found her directions very liberating, and actually, I remember going for a long walk one evening in Lincoln in probably 80 or 81 and experimenting with that, and suddenly, for the first time, actually kind of getting what Forward and Up was really about in an interesting way, and actually getting that I could influence the way I moved by my thinking. I don't think I'd ever actually encountered that experience before, but
Well,
that's just a personal.
that's so interesting. How, so were you still training then, or in
I was
England,
in
or
the
was
middle.
that?
Yeah, I was about halfway through the training course at the
Because
time.
I'm thinking, you've made me think back to my first lessons, which were, um, when would they been? The early 2000s.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and I was definitely, my teacher did not use the classic directions, although there were hints of them
Hmm.
within what she said to me. She'd talk about backs widening and things,
Right.
but it was definitely a thoughts that I could have
Hmm.
myself
Hmm.
away from her,
Hmm.
to help myself. That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't. To me, it's my impression in England at that time was that the directions were, everyone would talk about them, but there was a lot of unclarity about exactly what they meant. At least that's the impression I got. And so anyway, I fell under Marge's sway and
Hmm.
used her directions quite happily for a while. The next major development that I'm aware of occurred somewhere around 2007 with Missy Vinyard's book, in her introductory book to the Alexander Technique, in which she introduced what are often now called negative directions, or sometimes they're called inhibitory directions. And they would be directions of the sort, uh, I'm not tensing my neck, or um,
I'm not.
not
What am I not
not
doing?
I'm not well, one I used a lot was I'm not compressing myself, that
Yeah,
sort of
and I
thing.
like things like when I'm walking, thinking I'm not
Well, that's
walking.
the other type of it. There was
Yeah,
one
yeah.
type that just put
Was it
in.
very clear what you didn't want, and then there was another type that was like getting yourself out of your habitual way of doing a certain thing by thinking,
Right, right.
yeah.
And so, as you say, like while I'm taking a walk, I would say I'm not walking. And my take on that, and would immediately produce a
Yeah.
useful effect. And my impression of that was that my understanding of it is that you're really saying I'm not quote walking unquote. That is, I'm not walking in the way I think of as
I'm
walking.
not walking in my habitual way.
Yeah, in my habitual
I'm
way.
not controlling how I walk. I'm
I'm
giving it up to something else to
to
take care of.
find a better way.
Yeah.
I'm not do I'm moving, and it sure looks like walking, but I'm saying to myself, I'm not walking. Body mind, figure out a better way. And
Right.
negative. Both of those kinds of negative directions were just a huge improvement in my mind, anyway, over what came earlier,
Yeah.
because they did not make assumptions about what you were able to do.
Right,
They
right.
only assumed that you knew what the word no meant. Really.
Right, yeah. I just wanted to, you've kind of leapt from Marjorie Barstow to Missy Vineyard. I do think probably most teachers, maybe not all teachers, but a lot of teachers do have their own ways of teaching
Oh,
people to direct,
absolutely.
so there's all sorts of little variations and quirks or whatever, but these are, I guess you're talking about things that have kind of come prominent and taken on by other people and
As far as I know, I
yeah.
mean, there may be subsets of the Alexander world that I'm not aware of where there are other directions that
Mm.
have been used. I just don't know. I'm
Mhm.
kind of going on what I'm familiar with or what I've read about. But yeah, absolutely, teachers have come up with their own expressions, and also there are things that maybe aren't exactly directions, but I know various kinds of imagery some teachers have used, like back in the day, and maybe even today, some teachers may use a string pulling your head up.
I think most teachers don't like that anymore.
No, I hope not, because it's
Mhm.
not. I don't think it's a very. Marge Barstow used to go crazy when people would talk about that. She'd say, "Well, there is no balloon above your head pulling it up, so why create that image?"
Mhm.
But it's not. I don't think those are exactly directions, but they sort of function a bit like
Well, there's still,
directions.
I guess, there are thoughts we can have that could influence how we function.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. But then, yeah, they're a little different. Yeah.
So to me, negative directions, which I think have become quite popular,
Hmm.
were just a gigantic improvement over what came earlier. The only downside
Or negative.
was the word negative, which
Hmm. Or that I'm
some
not.
people,
Yeah.
some students, and maybe even some teachers had an inherent difficulty with, and you could explain to some people that it's a negative grammatical statement, but it doesn't mean it's negative,
Hmm.
and they still would be not happy about it. And so I found I with some students I had to spend
A lot of
a
time
lot of time
convincing.
on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to me it seemed like well, when the next um, development came along, which was roughly 2 or 3 years ago, I guess. And this is thanks to Jennifer Roig Frankoli in Cincinnati, who came up with freedom directions.
Right.
So, in terms of the neck part, my
Hmm.
neck is free. It's an actual, just a statement.
Hmm.
It's not a call to action in terms of your conscious brain. It just says that's what I want. You guys, meaning lower level systems, figure out how to do the best you can to make it happen.
Yeah, so I think I like both negative directions and freedom directions very much, and what they have in common is they put it into the present. So there's
Yeah.
no
Yes.
it gets it. I mean, I'm not saying it solves it completely because we're all human, but
Hmm.
it seems to at least minimize the kind of amount of trying to do them that we can get into.
Yeah, and they are
It could,
both very much in the moment and very much um, I I am or I am not in the case of negative directions, putting the sort of mental agency on your brain. You're saying that your brain is saying what it wants,
hmm.
and it's leaving the messy details to lower level systems is how
Hmm.
I look at it.
Hmm.
And freedom directions have well, at least two major advantages, I think. One is that they're shorter, which is always good. When my neck is free is a shorter statement than I'm not tensing my neck,
Hmm.
and that's an advantage. And you don't run into this problem of the word negative, which puts
Hmm.
some people off. And even more, an awful lot of my students just love the idea of freedom directions.
Yeah, I've found that with not all, but most, like you say, the just it's very appealing. I am free to do whatever, or this is free, or that is free. It's you don't have to get over that. Like I am not doing something that, and they're
Hmm.
even, and I guess there is some thought to do with language in the brain when you even if you're saying I am not tensing my neck, which I must admit was never I did like and I still do use actual negative directions sometimes, but I never particularly cared for that one
Hmm.
because I had to actually still think about tensing my neck, which I don't like doing.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and of course the freedom directions is none of that. Um,
No, to me, they just cut through a lot of issues.
yeah.
Um, another nice thing about freedom directions, and it's true to a certain extent in negative directions, students tend to figure out interesting ways to apply them that aren't really, strictly speaking, Alexander technique, or not usually what's considered
Mhm.
the province of
Yeah, you
Alexander
can kind of
teaching.
apply it in all sorts of interesting
Oh
ways,
my
can't
gosh,
you?
people have come up with just astonishing stuff.
But I
Uh,
guess you can with negative directions too,
oh
actually.
yes, that's where I first encountered it with students would come in and say, "Well, I just decided to apply this to a problem I had at work with my supervisor, or a problem with my husband or wife or whatever." I just formulated a negative direction and later on freedom direction to address that, and more often than not, they would find that it actually worked.
Hmm.
It actually brought about the change they were hoping for. So, to my mind, freedom directions are the best we have at the moment. I don't know. I can well imagine maybe something else would come along, but I have no idea what it would be.
Yeah, I have to say they are what I use most, but there are times that I still really go to the negative directions for some specific things as being particularly helpful or for a certain person being more helpful.
Hmm.
And I guess also want to say is how we direct or take in things, I think is very personal and we all have our different little associations with words and language, and I, 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 I do think the freedom directions tend to be more generally appealing, but not always. So it's good to
Hmm.
have alternatives. And
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if this is relevant to this discussion, but I've kind of been, and I don't really have an exact answer, but I've been exploring a little bit when I'm walking with both freedom directions, which would be some maybe I'm free to walk, would
Hmm.
be a nice way of thinking it,
Hmm.
but and the negative direction, I'm not walking. And they both seem to have a positive and helpful um, result, if you like.
Hmm.
But I don't know. I don't think it's exactly the same.
No, I think there
So
are subtle
I'm
differences.
I'm
Yeah.
kind of curious about that, and I don't have an answer. So maybe there's just different times when the different one is more helpful. The one is more inhibitory than the other. Maybe I don't know.
Or perhaps inhibitory in a slightly different
In a
way.
different way. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I make a point with my students. I start them with freedom directions, and I make sure they have a couple of them to work with after their first lesson, almost
Hmm.
always. But at some point, I go through a little bit the development of directions, certainly starting with negative directions, and I get them to experiment with negative directions so that they have that available. And particularly the negative directions of the kind you just alluded
Yeah,
to. I'm
yeah, they're
not,
the kind I'm most drawn
yeah,
to.
I'm
And I
not
still like,
doing, yeah.
I do still like the I'm not compressing myself is quite a nice one too.
Well, but back when I was living in a negative direction world,
Mhm.
that was the one people liked the most.
Yeah.
They just went for that. I'm
Hmm.
not compressing myself.
Because that kind of gets out of the specifics of what you
Hmm.
might be compressing or tensing, or which somehow
Right.
seemed more helpful to me. But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. No, that I think that's a wonderful direction. I'm not
yeah,
compressing myself,
yeah.
but I think I'm free
Mhm.
covers it as well. So.
Yeah, you're right. So different personality. I think most of my students prefer the I am free,
Hmm.
but I had one in particular, a doctor who um, was very, I guess, anatomical about things, and
Hmm.
I think it just seemed too airy fairy, this I'm free nonsense, you know.
Hmm.
Whereas
Hmm.
I'm not compressing myself. He could really understand, and his body could understand it when he thought it. So,
Yeah, there definitely are people who, if you, when you first introduce freedom directions, could react that, oh, this is some kind of new age nonsense,
mhm.
and I'm ready for that. I mean, but and I used to worry a lot more about that, but I find that most people,
Oh, he's the only one really I've had that's really not.
yeah, most
I,
people are fine with them. They just, if they work, and I make sure when I'm introducing directions to students, I make sure they know how to test it. I give them the exact kind of experimental process for verifying that it's useful. So, if it works, it works, and people generally are okay with that.
Mhm.
So that's where I think that's where we are now. We're talking in May of 2015, and who knows, in 2 or 3 years, someone might come up with an improvement over freedom
Yeah, no, I
directions.
think it's exciting, and I love being able to kind of empower my students with these ways of directing that they can really use on their own very successfully.
Because certainly before negative directions
Hmm.
came along, and even more, to a certain extent, before freedom directions, I never had students kind of spontaneously say how empowered they felt by
Mm,
using directions.
interesting.
That's a new development in my own teaching experience.
Hmm.
So that's about all I've got on the topic. Do you have
Well, that
anything
would,
else you wanna add to it?
yeah, no, I think that's great. Very interesting. Thanks, Robert.
Well, and if anyone listening to this has some information that I haven't covered, please let me know. I think at some point I might do a little blog on this, and I'll put this interview on the blog. And if there's some things I missed, I'll make a point of including them in the blog post.
Great.
So um, so my guest and interviewer today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. Thanks so much for doing this, Imogen.
Oh, you're welcome. Very interesting. Thank you.